In the final months of World War II, as the Red Army pushed westward through Eastern Europe and into the heart of Nazi Germany, millions of civilians found themselves caught between two totalitarian forces. The advancing Soviet troops brought with them the promise of liberation from Nazi tyranny, yet for countless women across Eastern Europe, their arrival marked the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is not a story told to diminish the horrors of Nazi Germany, nor to absolve the Third Reich of its unprecedented crimes against humanity. The Nazi regime orchestrated the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, enslaved entire populations, and brought unimaginable suffering to millions across Europe. Their crimes remain among history's darkest chapters. Yet within this context of total war and competing atrocities, another story emerged, one that remained largely unspoken for decades, buried beneath layers of Cold War politics and collective silence. It is the story of how Soviet forces, fueled by years of brutal warfare, a desire for vengeance, and inadequate military discipline, unleashed a wave of sexual violence so massive in scale that it affected virtually every community in their path. From the Baltic states to Berlin, from Budapest to Vienna, women lived in terror of the words "Frau, komm," woman, come. This phrase, spoken in broken German by Soviet soldiers, became synonymous with sexual assault on a scale that historians estimate affected between 1.4 and 2 million women, though the true number may never be known. Many suffered repeatedly, many died, nearly all carried the trauma in silence. This documentary examines a question that has troubled historians and survivors alike. In many occupied territories, particularly in Eastern Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, civilian populations, especially women, came to fear the Soviet advance more acutely than they had feared continued Nazi occupation. This paradox reveals uncomfortable truths about war, revenge, military discipline, and the civilian costs of total warfare. To understand the fear that gripped Eastern Europe in 1945, one must first comprehend the apocalyptic nature of the war that preceded the Soviet advance. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, unleashed a conflict of unprecedented savagery. This was not merely a war of territorial conquest, but a war of annihilation, guided by Nazi racial ideology that viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman and designated Soviet territory for German colonization. The Wehrmacht and its auxiliaries implemented policies of systematic starvation, mass execution, and enslavement across occupied Soviet territories. The siege of Leningrad alone claimed an estimated 800,000 civilian lives, most from starvation. In Belarus, 1 in 4 people perished during the occupation. Villages were burned, their inhabitants massacred. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions in German camps, denied even the minimal protections afforded to other POWs. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, murdered over 1 million Jews and other undesirables in mass shootings across the occupied East. By the time the war turned in 1943, following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war, more than any other nation. Of these, approximately 8.7 million were military personnel, but the remainder were civilians. Entire families had been wiped out. Soldiers returning to their villages found nothing but ashes and mass graves. Soviet propaganda did not allow its troops to forget these atrocities. Writers like Ilya Ehrenberg published inflammatory articles in military newspapers urging soldiers to exact revenge. Kill, 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 his famous 1942 article proclaimed. While Ehrenberg later tempered his rhetoric, the damage was done. The Red Army that rolled westward in 1944 and 1945 was motivated not just by military duty, but by a burning desire for vengeance. The Soviet advance began in earnest in 1944. By January, Soviet forces had pushed German armies out of Soviet territory and crossed into Poland. Throughout 1944, they liberated or occupied, depending on perspective, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and moved into Hungary and Yugoslavia. By January 1945, the Red Army stood on the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. The soldiers of this advancing army were a mixture of hardened veterans and raw recruits. Many had witnessed the devastation of their homeland firsthand. They had seen the bodies of murdered civilians, the ruins of their cities, the evidence of German brutality. Others were young men from Central Asia or Siberia, barely trained, thrust into the chaotic final months of the war. The army suffered from inadequate discipline, alcoholism was rampant, and the command structure often turned a blind eye to excesses against enemy populations. Stalin himself offered tacit approval for these excesses. When Yugoslav communist Milovan Đilas complained about Red Army behavior in Yugoslavia, Stalin famously responded, "Can't you understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes some trifle?" This attitude, combined with the chaos of rapid advance, inadequate supplies, and a desire for revenge, created conditions for systematic violence against civilian populations. The pattern was established early as Soviet forces moved through Eastern Europe in 1944. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, local populations experienced the duality of Soviet liberation. On one hand, the Red Army drove out the German occupiers. On the other, Soviet soldiers brought their own form of terror. In Poland, the Red Army arrived as both liberator and new occupier. The Soviets had invaded eastern Poland in 1939 in coordination with Nazi Germany, and many Poles viewed them with deep suspicion. Now, as they returned in 1944, Polish women faced widespread assault. In cities and villages across eastern Poland, the pattern repeated. Soldiers would arrive, search houses for valuables and alcohol, and assault any women they found. The attacks crossed all social boundaries. Elderly women, young girls, pregnant women, nuns were safe. Hungary experienced particularly brutal treatment when Soviet forces arrived in late 1944 and early 1945. Budapest underwent a devastating siege that lasted from December 1944 to February 1945, reducing much of the city to rubble. When Soviet forces finally took the city, they unleashed an orgy of violence. Hungarian historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of women in Hungary were assaulted during and after the Soviet occupation. The attacks occurred not just in the immediate aftermath of battle, but continued for months as Soviet forces maintained occupation. In Budapest's hospitals, doctors recorded a massive spike in suicides, abortions, and venereal diseases in the months following Soviet arrival. Women jumped from buildings, threw themselves into the Danube, or took poison to escape assault or to end their lives after repeated attacks. The Swiss embassy, offering protection to thousands of Jewish refugees during the Nazi period, now filled with women of all backgrounds seeking sanctuary from Soviet soldiers. Yugoslavia and Romania, though nominally Allied nations by 1944, suffered similar fates. In Belgrade, Romanian Bucharest, and countless smaller towns, Soviet soldiers assaulted women despite these nations having switched sides to fight against Germany. The violence was not selective based on nationality or political alignment. It was opportunistic and widespread. But the scale of violence in Eastern Europe, as horrific as it was, paled in comparison to what awaited Germany itself.
As Soviet forces crossed into German territory in January 1945, they entered what propaganda had taught them was the den of the fascist beast. Here, military discipline, already tenuous, broke down almost completely. Here, soldiers felt fully justified in taking revenge for the devastation visited upon their homeland. Here, the scale of sexual violence reached proportions that shocked even hardened observers. East Prussia was the first German territory to fall to Soviet forces. In January 1945, the Red Army swept into this region, and the civilian population, which had been urged by Nazi authorities to remain in their homes, suddenly found themselves at the mercy of advancing Soviet troops. The assaults on Nemmersdorf, a small East Prussian town, became a harbinger of horrors to come. When German forces briefly retook the town, they found the bodies of civilians who had been murdered, with evidence of widespread sexual assault and mutilation. The Nazi propaganda machine exploited these images, but the reality needed no exaggeration to terrify German civilians. News of Soviet behavior spread rapidly through remaining German-held territories, triggering one of the largest mass flights in human history. Between 12 and 14 million German civilians fled westward in the winter of 1944-1945, desperate to escape the advancing Red Army. They traveled in bitter cold, often on foot, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Many died on the roads from exposure, starvation, or Soviet attacks. Others drowned when ships carrying refugees were sunk, as in the case of the Wilhelm Gustloff, which went down with an estimated 9,000 people aboard, the deadliest maritime disaster in history. Those who remained behind, whether by choice, inability to flee, or because they were overtaken by the rapid Soviet advance, faced systematic sexual violence on a staggering scale. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, virtually every woman and girl between the ages of 8 and 80 was assaulted, often repeatedly. Soldiers would arrive in towns and villages and go house to house, demanding women. The phrase Frau komm became a death sentence for families who tried to protect their daughters, mothers, and wives. The violence occurred in broad daylight and under cover of darkness. It happened in homes, in basements where families sheltered, in fields, in hospitals. Pregnant women were assaulted. Women who had just given birth were assaulted. Nuns were dragged from convents and assaulted. Women who resisted were shot or beaten to death. Women who survived one attack often faced repeated assaults by multiple soldiers. The pattern in larger cities like Königsberg, Breslau, and Danzig was similar but on an even more massive scale. When the Red Army took Königsberg in April 1945, after a brutal siege, soldiers went on a rampage that lasted for days. Hospitals were invaded and patients assaulted in their beds. Women who tried to hide were hunted down. Groups of soldiers would take turns assaulting individual women. Some women were assaulted dozens of times. But it was in Berlin that the scale of violence reached its apex. The battle for Berlin raged from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945, resulting in the destruction of much of the city and hundreds of thousands of casualties. When Soviet forces finally captured the city, approximately 1.4 million Soviet troops surrounded the capital. What followed has been documented by numerous historians and survivors as a mass assault on the female population that lasted for weeks. German historian Helke Sander and British historian Anthony Beaver have estimated that approximately 100,000 women were assaulted in Berlin alone, with around 10,000 dying as a result, from suicide, murder during the attack, or from subsequent medical complications. Hospital records from the time showed a massive spike in suicide attempts, abortions, and venereal disease cases. The violence was not limited to Soviet soldiers acting alone. Officers often participated or stood by while their men committed assaults. In some cases, officers would requisition certain women for their personal use, which offered these women some protection from the general chaos, but constituted sexual slavery. Women who became mistresses to officers, often in exchange for food and protection for their families, occupied a desperate middle ground between victim and collaborator. Alcohol played a significant role in the violence. Soviet soldiers had access to vast quantities of alcohol looted from German supplies, and binge drinking was commonplace. Drunk soldiers were even more unpredictable and violent. Women learned to listen for the sounds of drunk soldiers in the streets, knowing that their chances of survival were even lower when facing intoxicated attackers. The medical consequences were catastrophic. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly. Thousands of women became pregnant from the assaults. Abortion, illegal under Nazi law, became a desperate necessity for countless survivors. Doctors performed illegal abortions in secret, often without anesthesia or proper surgical equipment. Some women tried to induce their own abortions with horrific results. Those who carried pregnancies to term gave birth to children who were often rejected by German society, labeled Russian children, and stigmatized throughout their lives. The psychological trauma was universal. Women who survived spoke of feeling utterly powerless, of watching family members killed for trying to protect them, of the constant fear that permeated every moment of daily life. Many never spoke of their experiences, even to their own families. The shame, both personal and societal, silenced them for decades.
For decades, the voices of survivors remained muted, their stories suppressed by political considerations, social shame, and personal trauma. But gradually, testimonies began to emerge, providing harrowing first-hand accounts of life during the Soviet occupation. Gabriele Kopp was 15 years old when Soviet forces arrived in her East German village in January 1945. For more than 60 years, she remained silent about what happened to her. Only in 2010, at the age of 80, did she finally publish her memoir. She described being assaulted repeatedly over several days, along with her mother and other women from their village. She wrote of how soldiers would arrive at their hiding places, how resistance meant death, how the youngest girls and oldest women received no mercy. "We were not human beings to them," she recalled. "We were things to be used and discarded. They would laugh and joke while they did it. Sometimes they would line up and take turns. We stopped being ourselves. We became empty." Anonymous diarists provided some of the earliest documentation. The most famous, published in English as A Woman in Berlin, detailed the daily survival strategies of women during the Soviet occupation of the German capital. The author, whose identity remained concealed for decades, described with stark clarity the impossible choices women faced: submit to one officer for protection, or face assault by many soldiers, cooperate and survive, or resist and die. Her diary entries from April and May 1945 paint a portrait of a city where normal life had collapsed entirely, where women traded sex for food, where gang assaults occurred in every building, where the sound of boots on stairs sent families into panic. She described the matter-of-fact way women discussed their experiences, having abandoned all pretense of propriety in the face of survival. Every building, every cellar, every dugout was full of screaming women. We learned to be grateful if only one soldier came instead of many. We learned to close off parts of our minds,
We learned that survival meant accepting the unacceptable. Medical professionals provided another source of documentation. Dr. Hans Harmsen, working in Hamburg's public health department, documented tens of thousands of cases of sexually transmitted diseases among women in 1945-46, most contracted during Soviet occupation. Gynecologists reported performing thousands of abortions on assault survivors. Hospital records, though incomplete, paint a statistical picture of the crisis. Ruth Kappelhoff, a German nurse working in a Berlin hospital during the Soviet occupation, kept notes on the women she treated. She described an endless stream of patients with physical trauma from assaults, pregnant survivors seeking abortions, and suicide attempts. We would patch them up and they would return to the same danger. There was no safety, no refuge. The hospitals themselves were not safe. Soldiers came there too. Religious figures also documented the crisis. Catholic priests and nuns, despite facing their own persecution, provided some of the most detailed contemporary accounts. Church records note the sharp increase in baptisms of Russian children and the pastoral care provided to traumatized women. Several nuns who had been assaulted themselves later provided testimony about the violence they witnessed and experienced. The testimonies also revealed acts of unexpected kindness and protection. Some Soviet officers tried to maintain discipline and protect civilians. Some Soviet soldiers, appalled by what they witnessed, intervened to stop attacks. A few Soviet soldiers formed protective relationships with German families, shielding them from other soldiers. These instances, while real, were exceptions to the general pattern. Survivors also described how German communities responded. Some families abandoned women who had been assaulted, viewing them as tainted. Husbands left wives, fathers rejected daughters. The shame attached itself not to the perpetrators, but to the victims. Other families stood together, with men risking their lives to protect women, and women supporting each other through the trauma. Children who witnessed these events carried their own scars. They described hiding in closets or cellars while hearing their mothers screaming. They remembered the terror in their mothers' eyes, the bruises they couldn't understand, the way their mothers would go silent for days after an attack. Many children only learned decades later what they actually witnessed. The psychological damage extended across generations. Children born of these assaults often grew up not knowing their origins, raised by mothers who could never speak of their trauma. When they eventually learnt the truth, they faced their own identity crises, trying to reconcile their existence with their origin in violence.
The assertion that women feared Soviet occupation more than Nazi rule requires careful examination. This is not a comparative judgment about which regime was more evil. History has rendered its verdict on Nazi Germany's unprecedented crimes. Rather, it is an observation about specific civilian experiences in specific contexts, particularly in the final chaotic months of the war. Under Nazi occupation, Jewish populations faced systematic extermination. Slavic populations faced enslavement, starvation, and murder on a massive scale. Resistance fighters faced torture and execution. Political opponents disappeared into concentration camps. The Nazi regime's crimes were systematic, bureaucratic, and driven by genocidal ideology. These horrors cannot be minimized or forgotten. However, for certain populations, specifically ethnic German civilians in Eastern territories and non-Jewish women in parts of Eastern Europe, the immediate physical threat under Nazi rule was different in nature from what they experienced under Soviet occupation. Nazi violence was primarily targeted at specific groups defined by race, ethnicity, or political alignment. For those outside these targeted categories, daily life, while restricted and oppressive, often continued with some semblance of normalcy. The Soviet occupation, particularly in its initial phases, brought a different kind of terror, one that was less systematic but more random and universal in its impact on women. A German woman in 1944, living under Nazi rule, faced food shortages, bombing raids, and the loss of male family members to the war. But she could generally walk the streets or sleep in her home without fear of immediate sexual assault. Under Soviet occupation, this basic security vanished entirely. This distinction became particularly stark in the months between January and May 1945. As Soviet forces advanced and Nazi forces retreated, civilian populations found themselves in a terrifying middle ground. Many women, in diaries and testimonies, described a grim calculation. Under Nazi rule, certain people faced certain death, but under Soviet occupation, all women faced probable assault. In mixed communities that included both Jewish survivors of concentration camps and ethnic Germans, this produced complex dynamics. Jewish survivors of concentration camps liberated by Soviet forces were often assaulted by their liberators. Women who had hidden from the Nazis for years, who had survived ghettos and camps, found themselves assaulted by the soldiers who freed them. This awful irony added another layer of trauma to their already unimaginable suffering. The comparison becomes even more complicated in territories like Poland, where populations had suffered under both Nazi and earlier Soviet occupation. Many Poles remembered the Soviet invasion of 1939, the mass deportations to Siberia, the Katyn massacre of Polish officers. When Soviet forces returned in 1944, they brought memories of past Soviet crimes along with fresh atrocities. Polish women found themselves caught between their hatred of the Nazi occupiers and their fear of Soviet liberators. Contemporary documents reveal this paradox. A teacher in Gdansk wrote in her diary in March 1945, "We longed for the end of the war, but now that it has come, we long for the war again. At least then we knew what each day would bring. Now every day brings terror." A Hungarian woman interviewed years later stated bluntly, "The Germans killed my father for his politics. The Russians attacked my daughter for being female. Both were evil, but one felt like chaos, the other like calculated cruelty." German refugees fleeing westward in 1945 were not fleeing the end of Nazi rule. Many welcomed the war's end. They were fleeing the Red Army specifically. Millions risked death by freezing or drowning to reach Western Allied lines rather than face Soviet occupation. This mass flight represented a clear preference to surrender to Americans or British rather than to Soviets. The behavior of Western Allied troops provides an important comparison. American, British, and Canadian forces also committed sexual assaults during their occupation of Germany. Recent research suggests tens of thousands of cases. However, the scale was vastly different, and military authorities generally punished offenders. Allied soldiers faced court-martial for assault. Soviet soldiers faced at most a reprimand for lack of discipline, and more often faced no consequences at all. German civilians noticed this difference immediately. In areas occupied by Western allies, women could generally move freely, markets reopened, and daily life slowly normalized. In Soviet-occupied zones, the terror continued for months. This created a stark divide in post-war Germany that presaged the Cold War division. It must be emphasized that this comparison applies to specific circumstances and populations. For victims of Nazi genocide, Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, and others, Soviet advance meant survival, even if that survival came with its own traumas. For resistance fighters in occupied countries, Soviet forces were genuine liberators. The comparison discussed here reflects specifically the experience of civilian women in territories overrun by Soviet forces in 1944 to 45. The paradox remains uncomfortable. A regime fighting against genocidal fascism committed mass sexual violence against the civilian population it claimed to be liberating. This contradiction reveals fundamental truths about war, that the evil of one side does not guarantee the righteousness of the other, that liberation can come with its own horrors, and that civilians, particularly women, pay prices in war that military histories often fail to record.
The immediate physical violence of the Soviet occupation eventually subsided, but its consequences rippled through generations. By summer 1945, as military control solidified and occupation became administrative, the frequency of random assaults decreased. However, the damage had been done, leaving scars that would shape Eastern European and German society for decades. The most immediate aftermath was medical. Hospitals across occupied territories dealt with an epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases. In Berlin alone, estimates suggest that half of all Soviet assault survivors contracted venereal diseases. Syphilis and gonorrhea rates skyrocketed, straining already devastated medical systems. Treatment was often unavailable, as medical supplies had been looted or destroyed, leaving many women to suffer chronic health problems for years. Pregnancy presented another crisis. Estimates suggest between 150,000 and 200,000 women became pregnant from assault in Germany alone, with similar numbers across occupied Eastern Europe. Under Nazi law, abortion remained illegal until the regime's collapse, but this prohibition dissolved in the chaos of occupation. Doctors performed hundreds of thousands of abortions, often in secret and in dangerous conditions. Catholic hospitals faced moral crises as religious doctrine collided with human compassion. Many chose compassion, providing abortions to traumatized women despite church teaching. Women who could not or would not abort faced different challenges. Russian children, as they were called, entered a world that often rejected them. Orphanages filled with unwanted infants. Some mothers abandoned their babies at hospital doors. Others raised their children in secret, never revealing the circumstances of their birth. These children grew up in a society that stigmatized them, blamed them for their origins, and denied them full acceptance. The psychological impact proved even more lasting than the physical consequences. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet recognized by that name, affected virtually every woman who had experienced assault. Nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and severe anxiety became normal features of post-war life. Many women never recovered psychologically, living with depression and trauma until their deaths. Suicide rates surged. In Berlin during May 1945, suicide rates were estimated at over 3,000 per month, 10 times the pre-war average. Many women took their own lives immediately after assault. Others ended their lives weeks or months later, unable to cope with the trauma. Some waited until years after the war, when memories they had suppressed suddenly overwhelmed them. Male family members also committed suicide, driven by shame at their inability to protect their loved ones or by despair at what their families had endured. The social fabric of communities was torn apart. Families fractured under the weight of trauma. Men who returned from the war to find their wives and daughters assaulted often could not cope with this reality. Some abandoned their families, unable to reconcile their masculine identity with their failure to protect their loved ones. Others turned violent themselves, their trauma expressing itself as rage directed at the women they felt had been dishonored. Women, meanwhile, faced a terrible double burden. They had to carry their trauma while also being blamed for it. German society, seeking to rebuild some sense of normalcy, often dealt with the mass assault by not dealing with it at all. Women were expected to remain silent, to move on,
to pretend it had never happened. Those who spoke openly about their experiences were shamed as damaged goods, as having brought dishonor to themselves and their families. This culture of silence pervaded all levels of society. Families didn't discuss what had happened. Communities avoided the topic. Government officials, focused on post-war reconstruction and Cold War politics, had no interest in examining crimes committed by the Soviet Union, which now controlled East Germany and much of Eastern Europe. In West Germany, discussion of Soviet crimes became politically complicated. Bringing them up could be seen as attempting to relativize Nazi crimes or generate Cold War propaganda. The silence had devastating psychological effects. Women had no outlet for their trauma, no way to process their experiences, no acknowledgement that they were victims rather than complicit participants. This enforced silence amplified their suffering, leading many to internalize shame and guilt for crimes committed against them. In East Germany, the situation was even dire. Under Soviet occupation and then communist government, discussion of Soviet crimes was completely forbidden. The official narrative portrayed Soviet forces as heroic liberators without mentioning their treatment of German civilians. Women who had been assaulted by Soviet soldiers could not speak about it without risking arrest for anti-Soviet propaganda. Eastern European countries under Soviet control faced similar dynamics. In Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere, communist governments suppressed all discussion of Soviet crimes, focusing instead on German atrocities and Soviet liberation. Women who had been assaulted by Soviet soldiers could not speak about it without risking arrest for anti-Soviet propaganda. The social consequences extended beyond individual trauma. Traditional gender roles and family structures were severely disrupted. Many women, having been subjected to such brutal violence, struggled with intimate relationships afterward. Marriages collapsed. Sexual dysfunction and intimacy issues were widespread. The trust between men and women in these societies was fundamentally damaged. Children raised by traumatized mothers faced their own challenges. Research on intergenerational trauma shows how parents' unprocessed trauma affects their children's development. Children of assault survivors often grew up in households marked by emotional distance, unexplained anxiety, and mysterious silences. Many only learned of their mother's experiences decades later, suddenly understanding the emotional dynamics that had shaped their childhood. German society as a whole struggled with these events in complicated ways. Some Germans saw what happened to German women as justified punishment for Nazi crimes, a rough form of collective justice. Others viewed it as evidence that all sides in the war had committed atrocities, a position that risked moral equivalence between Nazi genocide and Soviet assault. Most simply chose not to think about it at all, preferring to focus on rebuilding and moving forward. The division of Germany added another dimension to the aftermath. In West Germany, by the 1950s and 60s, some discussion of Soviet crimes became possible, though it remained limited and often politically motivated. In East Germany, silence remained absolute until reunification. This meant that identical crimes had wildly different levels of acknowledgement, depending on which side of the border survivors lived. For women in the Soviet-occupied territories, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the presence of Soviet forces continued for decades. The Red Army maintained large troop presences in these countries until 1989-1991, meaning women lived for 45 years in territories garrisoned by the same military that had assaulted them or their mothers. This constant reminder of their trauma, combined with the inability to speak about it, created a sustained psychological burden that defined their entire lives. The scale of Soviet sexual violence during the war remained largely hidden from public consciousness for decades, not through accident, but through systematic suppression by governments, historians, and societies on multiple sides of the Cold War divide. In the Soviet Union, all acknowledgement of the crimes was impossible. Soviet historiography portrayed the Red Army as a force of pure liberation, heroically freeing Europe from fascism. This narrative had no room for discussion of Soviet soldiers' crimes against the populations they liberated. Archives were sealed. Soldiers who witnessed or committed assaults were forbidden to speak about it. Officers who filed reports about discipline problems had those reports buried. Soviet authorities actively punished anyone who mentioned these crimes. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the future Nobel laureate, wrote in letters to friends about the looting and violence he witnessed during the Soviet advance through Germany, these letters were used as evidence in his arrest and conviction for anti-Soviet agitation. He spent 8 years in labor camps, partly for acknowledging what thousands of Soviet soldiers had done. Other Soviet writers and intellectuals who tried to address the issue faced similar suppression. Writers who included references to Red Army misconduct in their manuscripts found them censored or rejected entirely. Film directors who wanted to portray the complexity of the Soviet advance found their projects blocked. The state maintained absolute control over the historical narrative, and that narrative had no place for Soviet crimes. In East Germany and other Soviet-occupied Eastern European countries, the same censorship applied. Communist governments, dependent on Soviet support, could not acknowledge Soviet crimes without undermining their own legitimacy. Historical research into the topic was forbidden. Survivors who tried to speak out faced harassment, imprisonment, or forced psychiatric commitment. The secret police monitored conversations, and any discussion of Soviet crimes could result in arrest for anti-state activity. Documents that did exist were carefully controlled. Medical records from 1945 showing the spike in venereal diseases, abortions, and suicides were either destroyed or buried in archives with restricted access. Police reports about Soviet soldiers' crimes were suppressed. Even church records were sanitized, with references to Russian babies and assault victims edited out or removed entirely. But suppression of these events was not limited to the communist bloc. In West Germany, despite greater freedom of expression, discussion of mass sexual violence remained muted for decades. Several factors contributed to this silence. First, focusing on German women as victims complicated the narrative of German collective guilt for Nazi crimes. West German society in the 1950s and 60s was already struggling with how to acknowledge German responsibility for the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. Emphasizing German civilian suffering could be seen as an attempt to deflect from or minimize German crimes, an argument that created intense controversy. Second, Cold War politics made the topic radioactive. Any discussion of Soviet crimes could be interpreted as Western propaganda designed to demonize the Soviet Union. Historians and public figures who raised the issue were often accused of serving anti-communist agendas rather than historical truth. The fear of being labeled a Cold War propagandist silenced many who might otherwise have investigated these events.
Third, persistent social shame around sexual assault kept women silent. Even in West Germany, where women theoretically could speak freely, the social stigma attached to assault victims kept most silent. The few who tried to discuss their experiences publicly faced community backlash, accusations of exaggeration, or suggestions that they had somehow invited or deserved the attacks. Academic historians avoided the topic for decades. Graduate students who proposed dissertations on Soviet sexual violence were often discouraged by advisors who viewed the topic as too controversial, too politically sensitive, or insufficiently scholarly. The few who persisted faced difficulty publishing their research. Academic journals rejected articles on the subject, claiming they lacked sufficient documentation that was deliberately being suppressed in Soviet archives. Western governments also had little interest in highlighting Soviet crimes. During the war, the Western Allies had relied heavily on Soviet military efforts to defeat Nazi Germany. After the war, the Western Allies were trying to establish stable relations with the Soviet Union despite growing Cold War tensions. American and British governments saw no benefit in publicizing Soviet atrocities, which might complicate diplomatic efforts or be used by far-right groups to rehabilitate Nazi Germany's reputation. The first major crack in this wall of silence came not from historians, but from a survivor. In 1959, the anonymous diary, A Woman in Berlin, was published in Germany. The book provided a detailed first-hand account of Soviet occupation of Berlin, including extensive descriptions of sexual violence. The reaction was telling. German critics attacked the book viciously, with one reviewer calling it shameless and questioning the author's morals rather than the accuracy of her account. The book went out of print and remained unavailable in Germany for decades. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, occasional academic works touched on the subject, but always gingerly. German historians like Hans Ulrich Wehler mentioned Soviet sexual violence in broader works about the war's end, but devoted little space to it. American and British historians largely ignored the topic altogether in their accounts of the war's final months. The situation began to change in the 1980s as archives slowly opened and Cold War tensions eased. Feminist historians started examining women's experiences in war more systematically, creating an academic space for research into sexual violence. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened new possibilities for research as archives became accessible and survivors in former communist countries could finally speak more freely. In the 1990s and 2000, serious scholarly work finally emerged. Helke Sander and Barbara Jaw's 1992 book, Liberators and Liberated, provided extensive documentation of sexual violence by all Allied armies in Germany, with particular attention to Soviet crimes. Anthony Beevor's 2002 book, The Fall of Berlin 1945, brought the issue to international attention, with detailed research based on newly opened Soviet archives. Norman Naimark's work on Soviet occupation of Germany provided comprehensive scholarly analysis. The Russian government's reaction to this new scholarship was predictable. When Beevor's book was published, Russian officials and nationalist groups attacked it as anti-Russian propaganda. The Russian ambassador to Britain called Beevor's work lies. Russian nationalist organizations demanded the book be banned. Russian textbooks and official histories continued to ignore or minimize Soviet crimes, maintaining the myth of pure liberation. Even as more research emerged, controversy continued. Some German scholars argued that focusing on Soviet crimes against German women risked creating a false equivalence between Nazi genocide and Soviet assault, or could be exploited by neo-Nazi groups to rehabilitate Germany's image. Others argued that survivors' trauma and historical truth demanded acknowledgement regardless of political complications. This tension between honoring victims and avoiding manipulation of their suffering for political purposes remains unresolved. The victims themselves have had little say in these debates, their voices marginalized in favor of political and historiographical arguments between scholars and governments. By the 2010s, as survivors entered their 80s and 90s, many finally felt able to speak. Books of testimony appeared, documentaries were made, and museums began to acknowledge this chapter of history. But even now, comprehensive historical accounting remains incomplete. Russian archives remain largely closed to foreign researchers. Many documents were destroyed. Countless victims died without ever speaking about their experiences, taking their stories to their graves.